Okay, so this is the sixth video or the fifth video, and this is going to make the connection between the handout that I provided for you for assignment two, and I'm going to indicate what part of the essay relates back to the handout. Okay, because this program, for whatever reason, is not allowing me to flip between the two documents here on my laptop. Okay, but before we begin, what I want you to do is to put your demographic information in the header. So you're going to double click, and then you're going to write your name, the course, and the section number that you're taking with me, and then of course the due date for the assignment. Because what this is going to do, that it's going to identify each page that you submit to me. Because if you're in the face-to-face class, you're going to give me a hard copy, which I'm going to write my comments on. And then if you're on the online asynchronous classes, you're just going to upload it, and then I'm going to download them and print them out, and then write my comments, and then scan them, and then send them back to you via the Canvas shell. Okay. And the reason why I have you do the names, because if I accidentally misplace the paper, or if a page falls out, at least I know who it belongs to, what class, and what and what course you're taking. Okay. All right. So then this is how this is going to work. So I'm going to go to the introduction. So as I mentioned in the prior videos, that the introduction sort of sets up and lets your reader know what they're going to read about, but then also lets them know what they're going to experience as they read your paper. Okay. So, like, for example, point A, which is asking you to describe what your object of study will be for this research proposal. So, this is the sentence. You're going to write, the object of study for this research proposal will be globalization and the legal structure. Okay. Now, as I mentioned prior, um, don't get caught up with me talking about globalization, because the principle itself is attributable to any course. You just have to change the focus. Okay, so just pay attention to the process and the procedure, and not so much on the descriptions. Okay, or sorry, the topic. Okay, so like that's going to be your opening sentence, and that's addressing point A. Now this is point B. Describe to your reader how you represent your object of study. So this is what I wrote. To narrow the focus of this research proposal, will focus on the issue of human rights as a universal legal standard. To center this proposal, it will highlight the United Nations, or the UN, as the location of the debates, arguments, and discussions over how to implement and protect people's human rights. Okay, so then this is the description. Okay, yeah, and then that was my boy laughing because he's watching TV. Okay, yeah, so like that's point B. And then you're going to go to point C, which is asking you describe the problem or issue that your research will address. So then this is what I wrote. To accept the notion of human rights, to accept the notion of human rights, it is necessary to recognize that people, no matter from what part of the world or the type of political regime they may live under, or their cultural and social practices, are recognized as valid. Right. So what this sentence is literally saying is that we could argue as a society that people have rights that protect them. That's nice, right? In terms of like discursive practices and the use of language. But in order for legal rights to actually protect an individual or community or members of a community, the first thing that has to happen is that their legal rights have to be recognized. Right. So it doesn't matter what community or what scenario or situation, their rights have to be recognized first. Because if that doesn't happen at the beginning, then you could start seeing the human rights abuses that can happen. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay. All right. So then once you reference the problem, then you're going to describe how your research will contribute to the overall discussion, right? So then this is what I wrote. There are conflicts in different regions of the world where allegations of human rights violations are happening in the Middle East, the African continent, South America, and the Mexican US border, Texas to be precise. Okay. And then I continue to write this proposal aims to highlight the problem of how human rights are not necessarily recognized or fully protected within a global legal network. Human rights work establishes recognition of protections of every member of a global civil society, but it is to protect the most vulnerable of global civil society. So, like, that's sort of what I'm trying to deal with. Okay. Um, yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. And then this is part E, or the last part, describing to your reader how you selected it. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that this sort of establishes the relationship, right, between you and the topic that you selected. So this is what I wrote for this one. So then I wrote, once completed, this research is expected to add a deeper understanding of the challenges of establishing a protective cover by holding political, economic, cultural, and social structures accountable. Right. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is also sorry. Let me take this back. This is also addressing D. Right. Basically what you plan to contribute to the conversation. Sorry about that, and I sorry for any confusion. So this part right here is actually being addressed by point D. Describe to your reader how the research will contribute to the understanding of your topic. Okay, but you notice that it's still relatable to what I wrote. Sorry, what I wrote previously. All right, so this is the idea of homostasis as you write. Okay. Sorry. Now let me go back to point E, which is the last point. Describe how you came about writing it. So this is what I wrote. The reason why this research proposal will focus on human rights is that during my graduate studies at Northridge, I did a brief exploratory study on human trafficking. I came across a news report explaining how a 10-year-old girl in Hindustan, which is the actual name of India, where was she was wearing a tattered white dress holding a wilted flower and a sign that says, "Please marry me before my family sells me to a human trafficker." And this image has haunted me ever since. All right. So then this would be my motivation as to why I would want to do this study on human rights. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. So then now I'm going to go to the lit review. And as I mentioned in the section on the lit review, you're going to identify 4 class readings. All right. So then that's what I did here. So then I wrote the 4 readings that will aid in framing the research proposal are William I. Robinson, 2007, Robin Cohen and Paul Kennedy, 2013, Boa Ventura de Sousa Santos, 2015, and Kate Nash, 2015. Selecting these 4 sources will aid in framing the discussion of human rights and understanding the historical and moral implications of human rights laws and policy implementation. So you notice that I have my 4 and I included the year of publication. If you're not sure about the year of publication, there's a really easy way to do this. You could either use Google Scholar and put in the name and the title of the article, and you'll be able to find the publication date. Or you can go to Amazon.com and put in the name and title of the book, or the book, and then it will give you the publishing date that way, right? Because you always want to include the publishing date, and the in the order in how you put this together depends on you. So you could either do it alphabetical order, by last name. So then, actually, Robinson would probably go last, and then De Sosa Santos would go first, and then, Kennedy, De Sosa Santos, and then Nash, and then Robinson, right? Or you could do it by year. You could start at the oldest first, or you can start with the most recent first. But as long as that you're consistent and your reader is able to tell how you are ordering your sources, that's important. right? And that just lends itself to the idea of being able to utilize written structure and rhetoric or rhetoric in terms of like writing and all that to make sense. Okay, all right. So then once you sort of list, so once you list your four sources and you sort of set up how you're going to use it, then you identify, oh, this is one way, right? And this is the easiest format. So then I'm just going to read what I wrote here. Okay, about Robinson. So I wrote Robinson 2007 argues that to understand today's world, it is important to understand how political, cultural, economic, and societal changes results from a series of new processes that began during the 1970s. So this is a summary of what Robinson makes in the opening in his article, right, on the globalization theories of globalization. And then I continue to say about his work. These structural changes began to unravel the post-world order after the Second World War. The post-war order is what eventually developed into the global order of today. The mechanism that helped to establish a global order was the Marshall Plan, which was enacted on April 3rd, 1948. The Marshall Plan was a concerted effort by the United States to rebuild Europe. The plan was to invest billions in redeveloping and restabilizing Western Europe, right? Because that's an important thing to understand, right? In terms of understanding globalization from a modernist perspective, okay? And then the redevelopment and restabilization of Europe allowed the United States to remake Europe into its image. The plan allowed it to develop culturally, economically, politically, and socially. By the 1970s, the order began to crumble into new structures and processes. To account for these changes, researchers began to examine what the changes were and where these changes may lead. Due to these perceived changes, an explosion of research began to proliferate among scholars, politicians, and activists to understand these changes. And this is just indicating that this is a summary of one of the points that Robinson makes in his article. Okay. And then I continue to write, this is reflected by what Robinson writes, the explosion of research points to the ubiquity of the effects of globalization. So then I use this quote to basically substantiate everything that I wrote here. All right. And this is how I want you to start thinking and learning how to write. Right. By summary quoting in that measure. Because I'm going to do one more video going over the handout on how I evaluate the essays. Okay. All right. So then let me get back to this. So then that's what I'm having you do. And then and then I continue to write to finish off just Robinson is this. These changes are being noted to inspire generations of researchers to investigate continuities and discontinuities in a global world. This research proposal will focus on the question of human rights and the issues that arise over the question of recognition. So you notice I sort of give a summary or an interpretation of the quote, but then I also interpret the quote and connect it back to my topic. And then if I were to continue, I would write a little more and then transition to my next source. But if you notice, as I mentioned prior, this is the idea of homeostasis in writing. And homeostasis in writing is just your ability as the writer to fully develop your topic to the fullest extent possible based on your understanding, comprehension of your own ideas, as well as the ideas of the people that you're using to help write your essay. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Excuse me. And then this is what I wrote after summarizing and going over Robinson's article. I wrote this note. From the opening passage, you continue to write the body of the literature review, summarizing, elaborating, and adding your perspective regarding the object of study at hand. So that just basically says you just continue with that same process that I just demonstrated to you. Okay. And then once you're done with the lit review, which will be the biggest part of this essay, and that should be at the very minimum, at least like 2 to 3 pages or so. Excuse me. All right, so now let me go to the research questions section. Number Part 3. Okay, so then here's the opening sentence that I mentioned for this video tutorial. The 3 preliminary questions that will aid in delimiting the parameters for this research are, and then you have the colon. Now, the word, if you're not familiar with the word delimiting, is just a fancy word we use in sociology and academia to say the limit or the parameters. So you could use either of those 3 terms. Okay. And then, as I use in the description, then you're going to list your 3 questions. All right. So this is my first question. How does the United Nations represent the institution of human rights? All right. Which goes back to what I mentioned in the introduction. Okay. And then question 2, can the understanding of human rights be universalized? So this is basically what I mentioned in the introduction as well as in the lit review. Okay. And then number 3, do human rights agreements protect communities from mistreatment? And again, this is going back to what I referenced in the introduction as well as in the lit review. So does that start make sense now? Because what you're doing, this is also a check for you. If you can't find what you wrote in the questions and what you wrote in the previous 2 sections, then your questions have nothing to do with what you're trying to talk about. So then you could also look at this as a check or a test to see how well you're organizing your ideas. Okay? All right, now this is the last part for this section. Writing a paragraph explaining how your questions, these questions that I just went through, relate to your introduction and the lit review. All right, so this is what I wrote. These questions intend to explore the connection between globalization and human rights. The United Nations is perhaps the most recognized supranational institution, unlike its counterparts, the International Criminal Courts, or the ICC, or the International Criminal Justice, or which is the ICJ, right? Which are not as well recognized as the United Nations. However, this might be changing because of what South Africa and other countries are doing in terms of suing the Israeli government and violating human rights of the Palestinians in Gaza, right? Um, as because I'm not sure if you're aware, the South Africa, I believe, and I think Indonesia or maybe Malaysia are also going to sue the United States for its complicity in what's happening in the Middle East, right? So then, because of these cases that are being brought, people might start to begin to recognize these institutions, even though that these institutions are recognized in other parts of the world. Okay. All right. Now let me go back to the description and explanation. So, a lingering issue about human rights is not only which value human rights are grounded in, but also whether human rights are largely and morally recognized as a universal value. Because there's tension based on, like, well, whose values are being reflected in human rights? Because the debate, if I were to write like an actual longer paper, would be the controversies of how morals and values are sort of implemented in a universalistic perspective. Okay. All right. So let me get back to this. Okay. And then the last part. Oh, so sorry. This is part number 2. Okay. And then the last one is summarizing number 3. This may be a controversial point. Do human rights protect vulnerable communities from being abused or taken advantage of? So you can, well, not only see this like in the Middle East, but in certain countries in Africa, on the African continent, but as well as in Latin America or Central America. So, for example, in El Salvador, with what the government is doing in Salvador is that they're mass arresting gang members, and then they're putting them in this prison. And human rights organizations are claiming that it's a human rights violation. But then the other side of the argument is that crime and gang violence has actually gone down, I believe, by almost 80% or a little more than that. Um, uh, at least from an academic and a philosophical perspective, there's a lot of questions and issues associated with that, but I'm not necessarily going to delve into those now or for this assignment, but that's sort of like the gist. Okay. And then another one would be like the Texas Mexican border, where the governor of Texas put like barbed wire in the Rio Bravo or the Rio Grande, where like about a month ago, a woman and her child, I think, were caught up in the razor wire and they drowned. Right, and that from an international or human rights perspective is a human rights violation. Right. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, but the main thing is that you notice that these points are connecting it back to what I said in these two previous sections. All right, that going back to the whole idea of homeostasis. And then the last section I'm trying to finish is the outcome. And this is sort of what I mentioned in the last video. It is expected that this manuscript will aid the researcher in gaining a better understanding of the connection between globalization and human rights. Moreover, the manuscript will outline the history of human rights. Tracing this history may reveal the discursive practices that help to establish human rights, not only as a moral point, but as a legal practice. Coverage must be first recognized to be covered by the shadow of the law. And that's sort of what I mentioned earlier. Right. And that's basically what you're going to write on what you want to learn about your topic. And also the other things that I mentioned for this section in the previous video. And then for point 2 is where I'm asking what the reader is going to learn is this is what I wrote. It is expected that a reader will understand the history of human rights. It is also expected that a reader will come to appreciate the complex issues of human rights. Studying human rights is also an account of understanding the connection between global civil society's values. Right. And lastly, a reader will understand the issue related to implementing a global network of human rights. So if I were to write this out, instead of being almost 4 pages, this would be like 5 pages or so. Right. So like this is hopefully makes sense. And hopefully by me sort of indicating what part of the handout relates to what part of the essay, it makes it a little more clear for you and to also encourage you to do well. So I'm going to stop it now and I'm going to do one more video.